Today's sermon text is from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. If you want to read along in your pew Bibles, that's on page 4. Listen now for the word of the Lord. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Some of Jesus' most familiar and well-loved sayings and stories are the ones that take familiar elements and recast them slightly to make them unfamiliar. Everyone, for example, is familiar with wasteful, ungrateful children who run away and squander everything they have and then run to mom and dad to bail them out when they're done. And with a poor person who loses some money and is upset and goes to find it. Jesus takes these familiar elements and recasts them into parables. So it is with today's story, which is taken from the Sermon on the Mount, which picks up from last week's reading. Jesus today is talking about salt and light. Surely these are familiar with both light and salt. Salt, for example, is that thing that we usually put way too much of on our food in order to make it taste better. When I was in seminary, one of my friends was shocked at how much salt I put on my food. I could only respond that last I checked, my blood pressure was healthy, and after all, if your food doesn't taste good, why eat it? And if you eat really any type of meat or anything that's made out of potatoes, you know what I'm talking about. Salt just makes food taste better sometimes. Unfortunately, we've been hearing for years about how much salt is in pretty much everything we eat now. And that because the food we eat is, among other things, so salty, people are much more likely to have high blood pressure and to be obese. All of which can make today's analogy from Jesus of his followers being like salt a little jarring. We're used to hearing people talk about someone being the salt of the earth, meaning that they're hardworking, unpretentious, and always available to help a friend. And therefore they're worthy of respect. That's what salt of the earth is usually taken to mean. Since I came here a little over 4 years ago, I found that West Virginians pride themselves on being salt of the earth type people. And it's comforting that being the salt of the earth is a prerequisite for getting into heaven. But on the other hand, the thought of losing our saltiness, or of having to extend the meaning of being the salt of the earth further than we're used to taking it. It's all a little bit scary. If we lose our saltiness, we're going to be thrown away and trampled underfoot. Not really comforting. Salt and light are both familiar to us now, but in a world where salt was used even more consciously and light was much more scarce than it is today, people like the ones listening to Jesus would have been more aware of what salt and light both represented. They would have been recognized as things that made the world a little less frightening and a little bit more habitable, and that existed for the benefit of something other than themselves. There were some differences in the way that salt and light were perceived, clearly, in Jesus' day. Salt is used mostly for flavoring our food now. As it was at that time, they didn't have always all the kind of ingredients that we have available to us in grocery stores. So they had to make the best of what they had. And besides which, they didn't have refrigeration, and Israel tends to be very warm for a good bit of the year. So food would go bad quickly, and salt was used to preserve it. And so it was with light. We all know now that we need light to see by. I remember going camping with the Boy Scouts and with my church group when I was in middle school and high school. Grew up in the suburbs, so I was amazed when I stepped outside at these camps how dark suddenly everything became, and how hard it was to walk around on the rocky ground trying not to trip over anything. And so I very quickly learned to carry a flashlight around with me everywhere that I went. Of course, 2,000 years ago, that would have been a common experience. There was no electricity then, no street lights, car headlights, flashlights, none of that. So the world outside your doors or even inside your house when the sun went down was intimidating. And wild animals were closer at hand. And so a lamp was definitely not to be put under a bushel. It was to be carried around with you to make sure that you and the people around you could see where you were going. So salt and light were consciously things that were used to help people to see, to provide safety, to make food taste better and stay fresh longer. They added things to people's lives that were necessary for life to be lived without fear or illness or starvation. How then are we like salt and light as Jesus' followers? We're to provide a witness to Jesus and enable people to see him better. Jesus asks that we be the ones to show the world around us that there's a God who loves us and that there's another way to live besides doing the same things as the people around us. There's another perspective for us to see our lives by and our very beings. I thought also this week about the analogy of salt used as a preservative. What is it that we're to preserve? I think part of what we're to preserve is the word of Christ's lordship over the entire world and of his redeeming love and of what all that entails for the way that we live. It's easier and easier as the world gets noisier and noisier for us, even in the church, to forget who we belong to and how we're to live. And it's occurred to me that the church hasn't always been very effective in preserving the teachings about Jesus. I think we need to really work on that, remembering who we belong to and being able to demonstrate that to other people. Which kind of segues into the analogy of us being light for people to see by. We hope that people can see Jesus in all of us, in the way that we live, even if it means having to admit when we've made mistakes. I also think that we need, as Christians and followers of Jesus, to be willing to shine a light on the things around us that are harmful, that dishonor God and God's image in us, by calling attention to the brokenness and the injustices around us. Jesus ends today's passage with some very challenging words. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Until all those laws in the Old Testament are accomplished. There are a lot of them to sift through, and people make all kinds of efforts to sift through them. I don't think that Jesus is talking about dietary laws or laws about what kind of fibers we can use in our clothing or any of that. Isaiah's passage summarized what the law and the prophets are about. Why do you fast, but you do not see? Why humble yourselves, but you do not notice? Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day, and oppress all your workers. Look, you fast only to quarrel and to fight, and to strike with a wicked fist. Such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high. Is such a fast that I choose a day to humble yourself? Is it to bow down the head like a bulrush, and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin. This need to shine a light on hypocrisy and self-righteousness and attention to rules at the expense of attention to the worship of God. That's important. That's important for us as Christ's followers. A lot was made among more socially active Christian circles during the Super Bowl about the presence of human trafficking around large public events like the Super Bowl. And that was a good chance to shine a light on these evils that exist around us. We may not always have the means to work on such a large scale, but every act of kindness, every effort we make to shine a light on the suffering around us and to alleviate it honors Jesus and is a true act of worship of him. There was one other use of salt that I think maybe Jesus may not have thought of, because Israel is a warm country generally and not usually too icy. But here in the northeastern United States, we've had some snow and ice this winter, and we've gone through huge amounts of salt. I've heard news reports that some city in the Northeast has gone through like 140 tons of salt already, so much that it's running short. And we need this salt to put on the ground to keep us from falling. I a couple of weeks ago when it was snowing as I left church. I had a hard time getting back to Morgantown. I stopped somewhere for lunch and tracked some of the ice in with me and slipped on a wet floor, and my knee is only just beginning to feel normal again these last few days. So you realize how important that salt is in just helping us not to stumble. We as Christians, if we're following Jesus and encouraging others to do that, we can keep each other from stumbling. Life is slippery, frankly. There are all kinds of temptations and distractions in the world around us. If we're salt for people, people can taste God in the world around them and remain upright and continue to follow him and stay out of some of those temptations. The call to be salt and light for the world around us is an important one. It's also difficult. Jesus warns us not to let fear make us fail in our calling. He warns us that if we stop being salt or light, it's like getting thrown out and trampled underfoot. It's scary and difficult sometimes to follow Jesus in a world that holds up all kinds of other things as being important. And Christians have often fallen into the trap of invoking Jesus' name on things while living like the people around them. We all are familiar with that stereotype of the televangelist who preaches Jesus Christ on the cross on TV and then gets caught with another woman that he's not married to. I think it was, or embezzling money from their ministries. I think it was the Bakkers in the 80s. Jim Bakker and Tammy Sue, I think. Tammy Faye and Jim Bakker in the 80s when I was little. I just remember them being very outspoken televangelists who showed up on TV one day sobbing about what they'd done. It's easy to get distracted or to be so overwhelmed with all the brokenness and sin around us that we just decide it's safer to hunker down and wait for Christ to come back. But that's not what Jesus asks us to do. He asks us to be brave, to shine a light on the world around us, and to be the salt and light that helps other people to see God and to follow him. Amen.